global campaign for aid and development finance transparency. We envisage a world where aid and development information is transparent, available, and used for effective decision making, public accountability, and lasting change for all citizens. So we're delighted to have you here today for this session to give you a quick update on the format for today. So we've got 90 minutes allocated for this. First 10 minutes, I'm going to present the findings of the 3 reports we've produced over the last 6 or 7 months, looking into different aspects of localization. We are then going to have a fantastic panel discussion. We're very lucky to have some great minds with us and subject matter experts for today. We'll then open up for questions from the audience. For questions, you can either put those in the chat throughout the presentation and panel discussion, or you can raise your hand at the end, and I believe we can unmute you. So hopefully that will all work smoothly. We've got a really good range of attendees today. I had a look through the attendance list, so we've had sign-ups from lots of local organizations, international NGOs, UN agencies, and importantly, some of the donors and foundations who feature in the work that we're presenting today. So the one thing, before I get into the slides, the one thing I will say is we are very cognizant at Publish What You Fund, and this features in all of our work, that localization is a lot more, is about a lot more than just the money. However, we are Publish What You Fund, so we have focused on following the money from international donors and foundations down to local organizations. We have specifically looked at direct funding of local organizations. So when I'm going through the numbers and the percentages and so on over the next few slides, just be aware that this is, we're talking about direct funding of local organizations rather than funds that might flow through intermediaries, such as INGOs or consulting companies or UN agencies and so on. So I just wanted to make that clear, because sometimes there's a bit of confusion that we're saying only X% ever reaches local organizations, which is not quite true. What we're trying to focus on is that direct funding element. How much of that money is flowing directly between donors and foundations to these local organizations without intermediaries being present. So Henry, if we can go on to the next slide, please. So last week, we launched Metrics Matter 3. For those of you who have been following these reports, we've been producing them since 2022, and they've tracked direct funding to local organizations. The first 2 editions focused on USAID's performance in directing local funds, direct funding to local organizations, given the 25% local funding target that USAID announced a few years ago. However, for Metrics Matter 3, we've expanded the research to include 5 OECD DAC donors overall. So you can see we've got Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, the Australia Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Global Affairs Canada featured there. So our analysis this time round, as I say, the report was released last week, highlights that donors are only channeling a small proportion of project type funding directly to local organizations, averaging 5.5% across the 5 donors reviewed. The report shows that tracking ODA from bilateral donors to local organizations is going to be vital for advancing locally led development. And without transparent data on funding, because a common theme across these reports is the lack of visibility of how this funding is flowing directly to local organizations. It's going to be difficult to measure progress, hold donors accountable to the promises they've made, and ultimately shift more resources to local organizations. So that's the first report that I wanted to give you an insight onto. Henry, if we can move on to the next slide. So a few months ago, looking at these same 5 donors, we decided to, given that these donors regularly endorse global commitments such as the Grand Bargain or more recently the Statement on Locally Led Development, these are statements and commitments that have called for more significant local ownership in development and shifting more resources to local organizations. We wanted to take a look at these 5 DAC donors and understand their readiness and their progress to actually report the information that you would need to see to know whether they were making progress. So we developed a matrix that you can see on the screen there to serve as a visual tool to compare donors' readiness to track and implement localization practices. because we wanted to check how many of these localization commitments have translated into practical changes in how agencies measure and report their funding to local organization. And as you can see on the visual there, oh, sorry, Henry, if you don't mind going back to slide. As you can see on the visual there, USAID was far ahead in putting in place all of the processes and the systems and the reporting and the definitions and so on that are needed if you're going to actually report publicly on the progress you're making in terms of shifting more resources to local organizations. And then if we go on to the final slide, so those first two reports focus very much on those 5 DAC donors, but when it comes to the statement on locally led development, that wasn't just signed by international governments, that was also signed by a number of foundations and philanthropic organizations. In fact, 26 philanthropic foundations signed up to that commitment. So we wanted to go and do the same piece of work to look at how ready were they reporting? And what we found was that despite signing the donor statement on supporting locally led development, most of the 26 philanthropic foundations reviewed did not publicly report their progress on funding local organizations. Just 8 of the foundations we looked at maintain up-to-date publicly available databases with grant level details. And without this basic information, stakeholders can't meaningfully assess how much funding is going directly to local organizations or how commitments are being met. So there's a lot more detail in each of these reports, but the conclusions are quite stark. Obviously, it's clear that the amount of funding going directly to local organizations is very small. And then secondly, when it comes to transparency and reporting, the standard of reporting is not sufficient. We've had to do a huge amount of work behind the scenes pulling data together to be able to produce this analysis. It's not ready-made analysis that's put out, except for in the case of USAID, who have produced their localization reports. But what's maybe also concerning is just the lack of readiness to report. So the lack of systems, the lack of definitions, the lack of dashboards, and so on to report on this. Given the nature and the importance of the commitments that have been made, I think we were struck that more hasn't been done to ready these organizations to be able to report on their progress. So if I can ask our panelists to please turn on their cameras, I will introduce you to the experts that we have with us today. So I will start with Gunjan Vida. So Gunjan is the Global Secretary for the Movement for Community-Led Development. Some of you may know as MCLD. Gunjan is a public policy and international development strategist and agenda policy specialist. She began her career as a journalist and subsequently worked with the Planning Commission at the Government of India on policies around health, nutrition, marginalized communities, gender, and child rights. We're also joined by Sarah Rose, former USAID Senior Advisor for Localization. So Sarah was the Senior Advisor for Localization at USAID between 2022 and January 2025. She is currently consulting with the Share Trust, and I should be clear that she's speaking in her personal capacity today on this panel. Prior to her role at USAID, Sarah was a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, where her research focused on aid effectiveness and US development policy. Dylan Matthews joins us. He's the CEO at Peace Direct. His commitment to support local organizations in the global south spans almost 20 years, during which time he has worked for a range of peace building, international development, and humanitarian organizations. And last but not least, George Ingram, Senior Fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. His professional career in Congress, the executive branch, and the nonprofit sector has focused on international economic and development policy. He serves as Chair Emeritus of the US Global Leadership Coalition, a member of the Friends of Publish What You Fund Board, which is our sister organization in Washington, D.C., and is a member of the Executive Committee of the Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network. So let's get into the discussion. I'm going to start with you, Sarah. Why have donors not made more progress on localization?
Thanks so much, Gary. And I just wanted to thank you for hosting this event today. I think this is such an important time and opportunity to be talking about the continued importance of locally led development and funders' efforts to advance their localization commitments as well. And it's a real pleasure to be on the panel with Gunjan, Dylan, and George too. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you and with those of you in the room as well. It's a good question, Gary. Why have donors not made more progress on localization? And especially thinking that this has been a commitment that's been espoused for about 20 years, right? Country ownership, so to speak, was part and parcel of, the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness back in 2004. And it's been sort of in circulation since that time. So there's a couple of reasons, I think. First, aid is a system, right? So systems are complex, right? Systems change is also very complex. And in general, there's not just a sort of a single switch that you can flip that will change how an entire system behaves and how it works. And so when I think about progress and sort of sluggish progress, right, I see it as really due to a sort of complex, interacting variety of reasons. And there's a lot of them, right? But let me point to a few of them. So one is really about competing incentives, right? You're thinking about locally led development as really important, but there's also incentives to do things like move money fast, right? To hit key performance indicators quickly, right? Versus longer and sort of slower system strengthening kinds of work. There are different types of skills that are involved, right? There are skills that really focus on convening, on facilitation, on partnerships, on languages, right? And not just necessarily technical expertise. And so there's an evolution of skills that can be required to do this and to do it really well. There can be different mindsets about what the purpose of aid is and how roles should look within a system, right? There can be elements of risk aversion, which is related in many ways, at least in the United States, and I think other places as well, to the heightened scrutiny that foreign aid, sort of as an enterprise, has had placed upon it in many circumstances. There's an extra perceived need or desire to be able to demonstrate that everything is just as it should be, right? Resources, right? There are resources, including and maybe perhaps especially staff time, right, which is always scarce because it takes time to put into things like developing and maintaining relationships, to guiding new partners, to co-creating, to listening, and to thinking about how do you seek to understand local systems. And then, of course, there are sort of the practical issues like laws and regulations, among other things, that really place requirements on partnerships that can sometimes be hard to navigate. But, with all of that, I think I'd also note that, one of the barriers or one of the things that slows progress is that there's not a single prescription of success when it comes to locally led development and how a funder should work. There is not a list of what works, right, necessarily. It is very contextual. And so progress actually requires iteration, it requires doing, it requires listening, it requires learning, and it requires trying again, too. But I think it's important not to confuse slow progress with the absence of progress, because I think once you start to feel like the absence of progress, that can cause people to feel frustrated, maybe disillusioned, and maybe want to take their foot off the gas. And I think that we're not there. We have to keep going. So one of my very smart colleagues at USAID who've been working on and advocating for and advancing localization for 10 plus years there, he once said to me that the progress that we were able to make over the past few years, and there was real progress, was due to the conversations, the way the world was talking about localization that was taking place 10 years ago. So again, I think it's really great that, even as foreign aid has been massively disrupted, in the US and with other changes happening throughout the world, maybe especially because this disruption is happening, that we're able to have this conversation now about what we want to see and what partners in the global south want to see, maybe not next week or next month or even next year, but again, into the future. So thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And Gunjan, if I can come to you, your organization, your members, your partners are very much on the receiving end. What's your perspective on the level of progress and what could have been done differently?
So I think Sarah highlighted some of the reasons, right, very clearly on what's happened. Clearly, not enough has happened, right? We were definitely seeing a lot of stated intent around localization in the last few years. We were seeing certain changes. USAID was in many ways, recognizing and talking about localization, not just as a funding space, but recognizing that how intrinsically the question of power is linked to localization and how you cannot actually have localization if you do not address the power dynamic. So I think that shift was happening. But inherently, I think there was a huge challenge, and there continues to be a huge challenge in the way the localization conversation was taking place. So it was in many ways designed to not have the impact that we wanted to have, right? Because we are operating in a system that was never designed for localization. We were operating in a system that was never designed for trust, respect for local knowledge, mutual accountability, which are some of the founding principles of localization. You cannot have localization without that. And despite the conversation being on for 20 years, the conversation was really about changes to that existing system to have funding flow to local organization rather than how are we changing the systems. And so as Sarah said, there were all of these issues, starting with capacities. So initially we started by pinning it all on local organizations and saying, but they don't have the capacity. I think there is now a realization, at least I know with USAID, there was a beginning of the realization that, well, this is not really about local organizations not having capacity. Let's be honest, we don't have the capacity to work with local organizations because we were never designed to work with local organizations, right? That wasn't how we were structured. So I think a huge part of what we're seeing, why we did not make the progress on localization, despite this repeated stated intent around it, is because we were all operating in a system that wasn't designed for localization.
And do you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you feel like the progress until recent developments in the US and elsewhere, do you think that the progress was being made and that the future was looking bright, or what's your sense about where we are or were a few months ago?
I think a few months ago, there was definitely progress being made, right? When I say progress being made, I also want to be very clear, we were seeing incremental progress being made, right? We were seeing indicators come up for the first time. We were seeing accountability, at least by USAID, and, trying to then push others to say, look, USAID is trying to be accountable. Can you be accountable too, right? Till it all came collapsing down. So I think there was a definitely progress that was happening. But I think we also have to be very honest and clear with ourselves that that progress was incremental progress. It was perhaps the maximum that we could have done within the system,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And that's why I think this conversation is important to recognize, yes, there was stuff happening, and there's a lot of that which we do want others to have. The language access, very, very critical, fundamental for local organizations, right? If you don't understand what the call is, if you don't understand the language, the contract, the terms, how on earth are you even going to fulfill them? And that's what we've been asking local organizations to do. We are asking them to understand contracts, to sign contracts, to report in languages which are not even their second, third, or fourth languages. And we expect them to be compliant, right? Um, so there's definitely those things that were being addressed, and I think that we know we can learn from. But we also have to be very clear that those were all within that current framework, which was very limited in how much it allows for localization to play out.
great. Thank you, Gunjan. Dylan, coming to you, why have donors not made more progress on localization?
Thanks, Gary. Well, I would echo a lot of what Gunjan and Sarah have said. I think none of us would disagree with Sarah's points around the complexity of the system and the different incentive structures there are. I think there are lots of other issues that we haven't talked about around, for example, the role of intermediaries and how they've actually, in many respects, been a hindrance and have blocked progress because they want to maintain their privileged power, their privilege and power. So there are other dimensions I think that we could also take into account here. But I think the most important thing is something that Gunjan said. I just want to reiterate that because from the work that Peace Direct has done, we've been consulting with local organizations now for 20 years. In the last 5 years, we've consulted with well over 1,000 organizations around the world, and we've asked them this question, the question that you're asking right now, Gary. And actually, what we see is that there is, as Gunjan said, I think there's a question that Global South organizations are raising, which is, do they really mean this? Is this really meaningful? Is localization meaningful? In as much as they feel that this is a technocratic exercise. It emerged, we started using the words localization during the Grand Bargain World Humanitarian Summit conversations in 2015, 2016. And if you ever look at the framing of all of that, that was around, you know, efficiency arguments. It was all about how to get money to frontline first responders, right? But actually, what we're talking about here is much deeper than just efficiency, arguments around efficiency and effectiveness. We're talking about a fundamental change to how we understand how the world operates and who should be taking the lead in these things. And the Grand Bargain Agreement didn't talk about that. It wasn't really talking about power. It certainly wasn't talking about redistributing power. It wasn't talking about identity. It wasn't talking about structural and systemic racism and the fact that actually there are so many organizations that still want to cling on to power and believe that they hold the answers. They are the self-appointed experts. None of that was discussed when localization first became the buzz term. So I think actually when we're talking about locally led development now, we're talking about something much deeper rooted, really changing the system in favor of local efforts, which really centers on their dignity and their agency. And that can't be done with tweaking at the margins or at the kind of edges of the system. You've got to get into the roots of it, understanding what is it. And Sarah mentioned it actually in passing there. She said about the mindsets. Do we actually even share the same understanding of what we mean by some of these terms? Whose knowledge actually matters here? And actually, what I believe, and certainly in the conversations that we've had with the local actors around the world, is that actually those mindsets haven't changed. Global North actors still believe that they have the expertise and that Global South actors lack the expertise, and that we have to do something to those local actors to help them because there's a deficit thinking approach. Now, none of that is openly acknowledged, by the way. So that's something that most donors, certainly bilateral donors, won't talk about. But actually, that is a big part of the problem, is that we just need to identify and acknowledge some of these problematic attitudes. And if we do, we can start to have a much more honest conversation about how we change them. But if we don't do that and we talk simply about efficiency and we simply talk about mechanics of getting money, I don't think we're getting to the heart of the problem.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. And I'm looking forward to coming back to you and Gunjan in a minute to ask about how radical do we have to be in rethinking the system to really drive that change in the questions that are being asked, the discussions being had, the definitions that are being used, and so on. But before I do, George, I know you've spent a fair amount of time looking at the system, for want of a better phrase, the system of localization, the different actors, the different incentives, and so on. What's your perspective?
Well, I think Gunjan and Dylan make a good point that we have a system that wasn't designed for locally led development, and I don't think we've dealt with that fundamental issue. And a couple of specifics I would point out is donors have their own strategies and their own objectives, and they're accountable to the president and to the Congress and to the people on those, and they've got to try to fit those in with locally led development, and it's very hard for them to change those objectives that fit with local priorities. Secondly, Dylan's right. These donors are comprised of development experts, and they are accustomed to making the decision and knowing what's right. And they haven't moved the next step, which I would suggest is necessary. And that is, in many instances, local knowledge is more important than global expertise. And they haven't made that shift. And finally, I would say that these donors are used to working with the intermediaries. So their systems are set up, their personal relations are set up to deal with their own country intermediaries. And I would make two comments on your slides that are, I think, very telling, Gary. And that is that second slide shows that AID has made all of the right commitments and decisions and established the right policies. But they haven't made any more progress than donors that haven't made those commitments. And I'm wondering why. And I think it deals with the difficulty of changing the direction of a battleship. And a bureaucracy of 10,000 or more people is a battleship and hard to shift. And that final slide is new to me and really dramatic, showing that the private actors have not been able to shift their behavior. And we think of those foundations and private actors as being more flexible and nimble and innovative, but they haven't made the shifts too. And to me, that's a huge quandary.
Thank you, George. Um, so, okay, so I think we're hearing a lot about the kind of the diagnosis. Recent ODA cuts have sparked a shift in the localization conversation, but with funding commitments under threat, is it time to rethink the entire aid system? And if it is, what would it take to stop us from going too broad and stay focused on the topic of localization? If we're rethinking the entire aid system, what would it take to radically redesign funding structures and other structures that would truly center local actors and shift both resources and power while avoiding a return to kind of donor-driven dependency and some of the issues we've been in? So what needs to change at the highest level? And Dylan, I'm going to come back to you because I feel like this is where you were heading with your analysis of some of the individual challenges.
Thanks, Gary. Well, the first thing to say is I think there are a few people that I talk to who think that going back to the status quo is the way forward. I think actually the system needs a radical reimagining. So yes, we have seen cuts in North America, in Europe. And there are some people calling for just a return to the generosity, the so-called generosity of the zero point 0.7 commitments that some governments have made. But they are in the minority, at least in the conversations that I'm having. In the conversations that Peace Direct has with Global South actors are saying the system, as Gunnar said, the system is fundamentally flawed. So let's create a new system. And I want to just draw your attention to one particular initiative that I think speaks very strongly to this, and the Movement for Community-Led Development is part of this initiative. A group of Global South, Majority World networks, as well as some of their allies like Peace Direct, came together in February to discuss how to respond to this moment, how to respond to this crisis. And originally that we thought, let's have an open letter asking for better quality funding for local actors to recommit to make sure that civil society does get the sort of quality funding. Let's set aside the question around quantity, but let's get quality funding to local actors so that they can actually do the work that they want to do. But that letter evolved into something much more holistic. And I'd encourage you to have a look at it. You can see it online. It's called Stand with Civil Society. It's had about 600 signatures already, and it grows every week. Most of the large networks of civil society organizations around the world have signed it. And the most important thing about that is it doesn't focus on just the funding. The funding, I guess, and of course, I know that Publish What You Fund is focusing specifically on the funding flows. But what we're trying to say is let's step back from just looking at the metrics, because the metrics, of course, we understand the metrics matter. But we also know that Global South or Majority World civil society need more than just the funding. And so there are three requests that they're saying. First, the request is to support civil society to chart a path towards greater independence, agency, and power. So they're saying, help us to be more independent. Don't see just us as effective deliverers of aid or development. See us as agents that are going to help become more independent of you. They actually asked for they're actually inviting Global North donors, policymakers, and foundations to actually reimagine the system with them. So they are actively thinking about different ways of organizing, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's community philanthropy, different ways of organizing themselves to actually help break this dependency. So they want to be part of those conversations, and they want to do that with the Global North rather than it being imposed on them. So when we talk about reimagining, let's make sure that we don't fall into the same trap, which is that someone reimagines it on behalf of everyone else. And then the third thing is they said build a culture of solidarity, of global solidarity. So let's get back to that concept of solidarity, that we are walking with each other because our futures are inextricably bound to each other and our prosperity is bound to each other. And actually, if we walk together and we act in solidarity with each other, including solidarity that global South actors can provide to global North actors who might also find themselves in constrained environments or shrinking civic space, that's the kind of reimagined system that they want. And for me, that was liberating because all of a sudden we're sort of breaking free of this idea that the relationship between the global North and the global South, or the minority world and the majority world, is only one around funding. It's much more than that. It's about solidarity. It's about power. It's about sharing that. It's about identity, and it's walking together. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that, and of course, we can talk more about that. But I think that for me is the start of a really interesting conversation that is taking place right now, whether it's the Shift the Power movement that some of you may be aware of, lots of other different civil society coalitions really starting to think about what next, and not waiting, by the way, for the global North to tell them what that next step will be. They are wanting to be much more assertive in that, and in itself, I guess that's part of the spirit of the shift towards locally led development, is that actually the ideas, the knowledge is actually generated from those who are most affected by these issues.
Thank you, Dylan. And Gunjan's posted the link there. And Gunjan, I know MCLD are a signatory to the Stand with Civil Society, and Dylan framed it as that the global South is inviting the global North to think more holistically, to that invitation. How is that being received? And I'll add, there's a comment in the chat here which I think a lot of people are concerned about, which is this new design of the aid system, is this this rethinking, this redesigning, is that being captured by global North actors? I've seen, I mean, arguably this event could be seen as one of those, right? But there are other global North organizations that are trying to lead the way on some of this rhetoric, which is a little bit concerning. So how is that invitation being received?
That's an interesting question. I think it really depends on who you're speaking to and which space you're in, right? So we are a majority world network with 3,000 local and community-based organizations. And as Dylan was mentioning, you know, local civil society is not homogeneous. I think let's be very clear on that. Very often we kind of tend to think majority world civil society actors are like one homogeneous lump. They have one way of thinking, one way of doing, and one set of expectations. And that's not true, right? It's very context dependent. There's a lot of variation in it, but there's certain commonalities. There are commonalities in terms of values, there are commonalities in terms of principles, there are commonalities in terms of recognizing what has gone wrong with the system, the colonial nature, the political economy of it. So there is definitely a commonality that runs across the majority world and majority world actors, right? And I would say that if we look at, I'm going to start with, our members, right? Those community-based local organizations who are really embedded in communities. And it's very interesting to me because for them, it was never about an either or situation, right? It wasn't that there was no place for INGOs, intermediaries. It was about how do we revisit the power relations in the existing system, because all of us have a role to play, but you're occupying different roles than what you need to be doing and playing, right? And that's why solidarity comes into play, because solidarity is about, it's not you or me, which is what the current system has been about, right? The international development system has been designed, the ODS system has been designed on this whole survival of the fittest mentality and a competitive mentality. We want to keep 5 seats at the table. We want all of you to fight each other and pull each other down to see who can get to those 5 seats, right? And that's not what solidarity is about. Solidarity is about, why should we only have 5 seats at the table? What is preventing us from making the table have 50 seats and bringing in more of us and more voices together, right? And that's, I think, a lot of the intent of what we are saying. But I want to go back to Carrie, your question about what does it take to reimagine the system, right? And Dylan pointed to some of the things, but I think there's one very fundamental thing that reimagining any system or solidarity requires, and that is honesty. We have to be very honest about what are we creating and why. What is the purpose of it, right? In the last few months, suddenly there is this entire conversation around soft power and hard power and recognizing that, right? Finally, we are acknowledging that our system was designed as a mechanism, as an instrument of power. A system which is designed as an instrument of power is never going to enable actors or, let majority world actors shut off the dependency thing, and which is why we are in the situation that we are in. So I think radically going back, reimagining the system, right, requires honesty. Honesty on what is the purpose. Because if the purpose continues to be maintenance of power, it is not going to let us reimagine the system, right? It's going to continue to make sure that the people in power find ways to maintain that power and exercise that power. It's going to continue the cycle of dependency. And that is why I think the second thing a radical reimagining actually requires is moving beyond the narrow confines of some of our conversations. It requires us to recognize that how can you have locally led development in a system which is constantly draining majority world nations of their resources, where governments have to rely on international assistance to be able to provide basic services. There is something fundamentally flawed in that system, right? There is something fundamentally flawed in a system which enables one country to determine the fate of medicine availability, food availability for thousands and millions of people around the world. And that is because our system is not designed around people. Our system is designed around power. And so a radical reimagining of the system requires centering people, not power. And that means our conversations have to go to the people as well. We talked about how people don't understand there's greater scrutiny for foreign aid and why it's being done and stuff. People don't understand it. But if there is an alignment in values, do we genuinely believe that people around the world, the broader population, does not understand and value dignity and knowledge and rights? Because if we believe that they do value that, then we need to involve them in these broader conversations. So I think a radical reimagining of the system absolutely needs us to think about who is at the table, but also where are we setting up that table? Are these tables continuing to be in these, very elite circles in spaces in Geneva, in DC, in other places? Or are these circles broad enough to have the people in it and to engage at that level? Because that is where we have lost out. All around the world, we are seeing an erosion of trust in civil society. And that is because the current system has actually really taken a toll on the trust that we as civil society actors, local civil society actors, had with the people.
Thank you, Gunjan. If this is the opportunity to redesign the system and whatever comes next, and hopefully it's far better and far more equitable and all of the things we've talked about, it is likely that there will be targets associated with it. Sarah mentioned key performance indicators earlier on. We're very cognizant of the potential and the potential good and the potential harm that can come through creating specific targets. Now, funding targets such as those set by the Grand Bargain, by USAID, have been used to drive increases specifically in direct funding, but there are also key performance indicators and targets relating to other aspects of localization that have been introduced in the past, admittedly and caveating constantly within a system that wasn't designed for localization. While they can create accountability and momentum, there are also criticisms about the effectiveness of targets and the risk of focusing on numbers over impact, and the risk of focusing on things that are measurable over things that are less measurable. I'll come to Sarah and George with this first. In your view, what have we learned from trying to measure localization? Do we think that the things we've been trying to measure, predominantly funding, have those targets have been the right tool to drive meaningful change? Have they been a distraction? Have they oversimplified something complex? What was your, maybe coming to you first, Sarah, from your inside experience? What was your sense?
Yeah, really great question, Gary. So targets, like, do they risk oversimplifying a complex issue? Yes, they do, right? Are they still a useful tool? I think to that I would give it a qualified yes. And let me actually start there because I think that's important. So I also want to say too, like, we don't have full information about what US foreign assistance is transforming into at the moment, right? And maybe we can go back to that a little bit in a minute too. But we do know, right? And I expect this will be the case going forward, that US aid staff, have often faced multiple urgent priorities, right? And so when people have to choose from among these priorities, because you just can't maximize everything, there can be an incentive to focus on the things that you are going to be concretely held to account for doing. And so what we've seen is that, when we have targets that are backed by leadership, right? Like they can push people to more proactively act in ways or seek opportunities, or think about balancing risks, right? In ways that they otherwise might not do. And I think that USAID's HIV programs are a prime example of the success of targets pushing different types of behaviors, right? So in 2018, PEPFAR, that's the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the leadership of PEPFAR imposed a target that the United States would channel 70% of HIV funding through local and government partners. Of course, recognizing that if you're going to have a sustainable response to HIV, this has to be led by local systems, right? Not through international actors. At the time, USAID's HIV programs were less than 20% local, right? Now, they didn't hit their target in the initial time frame. This was a blazingly unrealistic 2 years that was first set, right? But 6 years later, right before USAID was dismantled, well over 60% of HIV funding was going through local partners, including government partners, without compromising service delivery. And this was all thanks to the intentionality that was, really forced around finding new partners, around capacity strengthening, around managing risk, around learning and sharing about how to do this. And this wouldn't have happened without targets. But now here's the big but, right? And this is, what Dylan was talking about too, right? To really move toward sustained and locally owned development, you have to focus on more than local implementation and like the nationality of the implementing partner and where resources are going. Locally led development is most fundamentally about shifting power, and shifting resources are a subset of that. It's one form, and it's an important form, but it's one form of how you exercise power, right? So what is really necessary is, do you have local leadership to set the agenda, to establish priorities, to develop solutions, to bring local expertise and capacities to help implement and deliver those solutions, right? If you shift funding in the absence of shifting decision-making power, this is not locally led development. We have to focus on the quality of the process. It's the relationship that matters the most. And furthermore, I would say this too, right? Like, donors are seeking, or have been seeking to shift more resources to local actors. But honestly, it is likely to remain a minority of funding, right? Grand bargain commitments are 25%. USAID's former, commitment that we were working towards was 25%. And of course, this suggests that most funding is probably still going to be going through international partners, right? And this may be especially true in the United States going forward, with significantly fewer staff and a lot of contracting and award-making functions concentrated in Washington, right? So if you have a target that is just about local funding, what it does is it lets donors and it lets international partners off the hook for the wide range of actions that they can take to elevate local leadership. And there are many ways that they can do this, right? From co-creating, from learning and adapting with local actors, focusing on equitable subaward practices, to local accountability and feedback mechanisms, and so many more, right? But this focus has often gotten the short shrift, right? In part because it's easy to measure funding. It's not that easy. Gary, you were talking about how labor intensive it was to actually gather the data that you gathered, right, for that report. But it's straightforward, right, in some ways. How you think about what is the act of elevating local leadership, that's complex. It's multifaceted. It's context dependent. It's really hard to measure, right? USAID tried. We had just started to track the extent to which USAID programs were utilizing a set of good practices, right? That we heard from community-based organizations, from local partners, from international partners, from USAID staff, that were seen as meaningful, right? And really moving the needle for what felt like you had a say, right, over what programming looked like. So we had just started to track these practices that advance locally led development across the project lifecycle. But of course, even that imperfectly captures the nuances and opportunities for local leadership. And so I think the answer is both of these things, right? That yeah, targets can be important ways to motivate behavior, but you have to be so careful with how you think about targets, right? Because they are, by definition, anything quantifiable is going to narrow what you're looking at. And locally led development can never be encapsulated in a single set of measures. But any measures that you have, have to go beyond just that funding frame, and think about that power.
Thank you, Sarah. And it reminds me of some of the wrestling that we did in 2021 when we started preparing for the first Metrics Matter report, and we were talking to local organizations, and they were telling us that, the funding is the worst proxy for localization, but it is the one that we can measure. It is some kind of poor proxy for having a seat at the table if you're getting direct funding from a large international funder or from a foundation, but it certainly is not sufficient by any extent. George, your thoughts?
Very quickly, I would start where Sarah ended, and that is targets are very important, but you've got to be very careful how you set them. And they can be a distraction. They can lead you astray if you don't set them carefully. I have always been somewhat skeptical of targets because most of the ones I've seen have been drawn out of a hat with no real basis for the likelihood of them being achieved in a certain period of time. On the other hand, they're very important to hold systems, bureaucracies, people accountable for what they're expected to achieve. But the problem is an organization like AID has a dozen priorities. And how do you balance those priorities and have targets for each one of those priorities that don't conflict with each other? So, Sarah's message is very right. You've got to have targets, but you've got to be very careful how you set them, and particularly the expectations that you build around them. And too often, the expectations are too grand and are expected to be achieved within a short period of time. All from me.
Thanks, George. Dylan, I know you've done some thinking on this. What are your thoughts?
Really, just to build on what Sarah and George said there, I think we would agree with all of that. I think that the problem isn't the target in itself, it's the primacy of the target within the thinking of a funder. And I think so, this is why I just wanted to share my thoughts on the donor statement on supporting locally led development. For us, that was a really elegant, really interesting, really progressive statement because it had three commitments. The first commitment was around increasing funding to local actors. And so you can quantify that, you can then hold people accountable to that. The second one was around shifting and sharing power. And as we say, with most of these targets, we talk about the quantitative stuff because it's easy to measure. How do you measure things like shifting and sharing power? It's hard, but actually it's absolutely critical because, as Sarah said, if you just focus on the funding, but you don't change the underlying power structures and the decision making and whose knowledge you value, then all of your changes are meaningless, which is part of the reason why the Grand Bargain Agreement failed. And the third commitment is around publicly advocating in your spaces and to others for locally led development. So continuing to build the momentum. Now, those three really neatly connect with each other. Shifting and sharing power, advocating in your spaces, advocating to others, and then, of course, the numerical target or the more measurable target about funding flows. Now, the thing is, the devil's in the detail because what then tends to happen is people then shift to the lowest common denominator or the one that's easily measured, which is the funding one. And they then say, well, let's not worry about the shifting and sharing power because we don't really understand that. But I think that we've got to make sure that however we go forward, We take a much more holistic approach. So at Peace Direct, we've been working with MCLD and some others for the last 2 years now on what we call a funder scorecard. And the whole idea of the funder scorecard is to understand how do you even measure how you shift and share power? How do you do that? And actually developing a scorecard, which is actually a self-assessment tool to help funders to be able to ask themselves the questions so that they can hold themselves account, but also others can hold them to account. So we can actually start to see those more nuanced dimensions being tracked as well. And yes, it's difficult, and you may not even be able to arrive at one answer within an institution or within one funder, because within one funder you have different departments and different units that operate differently. So you might find super progressive thinking in one part of an institution and not so progressive thinking in another, but you could still use some kind of tool to be able to assess, are you shifting and sharing power? And that in itself is as important, if not more so, than the actual figure, the actual target around funding flows.
Thank you, Dylan. So I'm going to come to Gunjan and George with this question first. So if this reinvention, this reimagining, this transition to locally led development is to be successful, a question a lot of people are asking is, what, if any, are the roles that INGOs can play? Advocates versus their current role as gatekeepers, bottlenecks, disablers, enablers, capacity building. Gunjan, coming to you first. What's your sense?
So I think the first and foremost thing that INGOs can do is on addressing public opinion in their own countries. We are seeing, I think the one thing the last few years have shown us very, very clearly is the disconnect between what people around the world in countries and communities think about development, development systems, the paradigms that we have, how they engage with them, how they think about people in different parts of the world, the conversations that we are having about who has knowledge, who has power, how do we respect and see and recognize that power is not, knowledge does not emerge from one part of the world and is not the property of one part of the world, but it has existed and is fostered and created in everywhere around the world in communities, right? That's a worldview that we need to socialize. That's a worldview that we need to tackle around the anti-rights movements that we are seeing happening in so many countries, right? And that is why I think INGOs have a very, very strong role to play in actually countering the anti-rights voices in their countries, in ensuring that there is, in the countries where they are in, because here's the thing, I, as a local actor in India, right, my members sitting in Somalia or sitting in DRC or in Malawi or in Honduras and all, do not even have the ability to reach the people, their representatives in these countries. But INGOs have that power. So I think that's one very fundamental role that INGOs can play, is in terms of shifting the perspective, shifting that whole narrative around, which is there in the minority world, around the trust, around the capacity, around the resourcefulness of majority world actors. That is a very, very important role. The second role that INGOs absolutely can play is in bridging, right? So we currently have a system which is not designed for localization. We are talking about changing that system. Changing that system also requires resources in the interim. It doesn't just happen, right? And local actors need these resources if they need to be able to shape these systems. But who are the people? Where is the influence on the current set of resources and ODA? It is with the international actors and the INGOs. So there's absolutely a role in terms of ensuring and connecting the local voices with the policymakers, which where decisions are currently being made on what is available in funding, right? And then finally, I personally believe, and I know there is, Peace Direct has a whole report on this, so Dylan, I know you will probably talk about the 9 roles that you have in that. But I think the biggest role that INGOs can play, right, and not just INGOs, I think that all of us can play for each other in this current system is of allies. In whichever spaces we are in, we need to show up as allies. And we need to recognize the allyship of others in this. So if you are an INGO in the US and you are dealing with what is happening, local actors around the world have dealt with this for many years in their own countries. See them as allies, learn from them. And similarly, show up as allies when local actors are facing these in their countries, right? So there is definitely, to me, those are the three roles that we see a very valuable thing because knowledge, right? There is this term, we call it nurturing serendipity in MCLD. I know in the Silicon Valley, they call it engineering serendipity. Well, when you bring diverse knowledge, experiences, and expertise together, what you get is much more than the sum of all parts. So I would argue that if local actors and international organizations bring their knowledge together, what we get is so much richer because that's what we do at MCLD in our spaces. It's not one or the other. It's how do we work together in a power neutral sense.
Thank you, Gunjan. George, I'm going to come to you, and then I will come to Dylan after to just briefly give an introduction to his work on this. But George, you've been hosting a series of roundtables, a variety of actors involved. A number of those actors are international organisations of one type or another. What's your sense about the future role of INGOs from what you're hearing?
Well, I think Gunjan's last 2 points on serving as allies and recognizing that we live in an interconnected world. And, as much as we talk about increasing self-reliance by developing countries, they're part of an integrated world and we've got to all work together. I would suggest that one issue that's never been addressed to my mind is why is it better for a Northern donor to be the direct funder than a Northern NGO? And if it's difficult for the donor to provide the assistance directly because of all the reasons Sarah laid out, what if the donor put the onus on the intermediary to behave, to act in a locally led development, to buy into the missions of local organizations and not provide them contract, but provide them grants to support what their self-appointed missions are? To me, that is one way that large international NGOs, which have a lot of presence on the ground, and so know the ground better than the Washington-based donor, can play a constructive role. But it means that INGO needs to realize that its purpose is to support local organizations, not to support its own conception of what the world looks like. And just very briefly, and Gunjan mentioned a few of these, they can share knowledge, they can be conveners, they can do fundraising, and they can help build strengthen the support of local organizations. Thanks.
Thank you, George. And Dylan, you've put the link in the chat to the paper that Gunjan mentioned. I don't want to suggest that you can give us a meaningful introduction to what I'm sure is a very thorough piece of work. But is there anything you want to say on that report?
Well, a lot. How much time have you got? Look, the thing I would say is, and I've committed my whole career to working in this sector and working for INGOs, and I'm very proud of the work that the INGOs that I've worked for have done. And it has become abundantly clear to me at Peace Direct, in the time that I've been at Peace Direct, and the research that we've done and the consultations that we've done, that INGOs, in their quest to help and to support more people and to lift more people out of poverty, however you want to describe it, they've actually done harm as well. And I think that's a really difficult pill for them to take, that actually INGOs have actually suppressed the growth of local civil society. We worked with the Shift the Power movement a few years ago, released a report called Too Southern to be Funded. I'll put the link in the chat. That analyzed OECD DAC data that showed, a bit like your report, Gary, it showed that funding for CSOs worldwide from OECD members, 93% of it went to CSOs based in global north countries. 7% went directly to Global South. Now, of course, there will be arguments that some of that money that went through, INGOs went to local organizations. But the reality is that INGOs have grown fat on overseas assistance funding that was meant for really supporting communities to lift themselves out of poverty, to empower them, etc., etc. And I think that INGOs have to radically rethink their roles. And the purpose of the paper was to say to people, imagine a time where INGOs no longer acted as implementers anywhere, or that they had any role in grant management. So the 9 roles we asked our partners, we have partners in 14 countries around the world. We have no overseas offices. So we asked our partners, what are the roles that you value about Peace Direct if we didn't provide you with any funding? And actually we were really surprised that they had 9 very distinct roles for us that they value. And those 9 roles we think are very valuable for INGOs to play. But as George said, they are not implementation roles. They are not grant management roles. As Gunjan said, they are about being a sidekick, an ally, a convener, a connector, playing a role that actually puts us in the passenger seat, not in the driving seat. And I'm not sure that many INGOs are prepared for that. Most INGOs still want to be in the driving seat, managing the funds, because it's given them power and influence. And of course, they've helped people. We're not saying that they haven't, but they have caused harm in the pursuit of their mission by actually holding back the development, the organic development of a vibrant civil society in each of those countries, because they just don't have money. Those local organizations are starved of funds. You go to any country, and the people where most of the overseas aid goes, and INGOs dominate the sector. And that has to change. So if we're talking about locally led development, we're talking about changing the system, we've also got to look at those gatekeepers and those who have retained power. And we tend to focus solely on the donors, but actually INGOs bear a lot of the responsibility as well. They would argue, sometimes they would say, well, actually, it's the donors who want to fund us. I think that's a lazy excuse. I think INGOs have to start to say, we have to step back and not take up so much space. And in doing so, they will then send a message to funders who will then say, okay, we need to fund directly. So actually, they do play a critical role in trying to change the system or holding the system in place so that it benefits them in perpetuity, which is, I think, a risk still. Despite all of the conversations that we're having right now, there's still a risk that the INGOs take up too much space.
Gary, let me add one thing to that.
Yeah, please.
And that is one of the damages that INGOs and donors have provided is they've shifted the accountability from local communities and stakeholders to the INGOs and donors. And donors and INGOs have got to figure out a way to provide assistance that the accountability remains with the local communities in the original mission of what organizations they're supporting.
Thanks. Thank you, George. And Sarah, did you want to contribute to this?
Yes. So I just want to underscore, I mean, so much of what was just said, but I wanted to think about this question with a slightly different framing. And it's a US focused framing, but I think that there's some other broader relevance as well. And that is to say that, so everyone in this room, I think, believes that locally led development is critical, right? But I think there's also an assumption here that we need to be clear about, right? And that assumption is that it is critical for aid that is pursued with development outcomes or humanitarian outcomes as the goal. And that donor interest, and I'm thinking about US interest right here, is framed as mutual interest, right? Like we're all better off with better public health, with global economic advancement, with peace and stability, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a different rhetoric around aid that is ascendant at the moment, right? I think this is a little bit of a radical reimagining in the opposite direction of what Dylan was calling for, right? So, for instance, right, PBS NewsHour just did a segment looking at local partners, right? And they cited a State Department spokesperson that was saying, U.S. foreign assistance will be transformed into a short-term, targeted, and transactional force that fiercely prioritizes America's interest. So Gunjan was exactly right? The donor power side of aid has always existed. It has always coexisted, sometimes a bit uncomfortably, with sort of that altruistic or that partnership side of aid. And again, to be honest and to agree with Gunjan, right, there is some value in being very frank about this donor interest side of the ledger, which I think has sometimes been glossed over in some of these partnerships, even if it's always been there. But economic development, right, and the local system strengthening that needs to underpin it is not short term. It's not transactional. That's something else, right? And so then, what is the role of local actors in that something else? And it depends, right? And it's one thing for like governments to negotiate as peers, but on a case by case and context by context basis, there has to be deep respect for how global South-based civil society organizations and community groups want to be involved in a type of aid that is designed to be more self-interest than mutual interest, right? And so this is a question about INGOs. And I think INGOs, right, many of which have been keen to think about what their role is in advancing locally led development, are going to have to navigate this.
Thank you, Sarah. And just a perspective from being the Global Campaign for Aid Transparency, one of the most common questions that we get that we're unable to answer is the flow through of funds through INGOs, through other intermediaries to local organizations. And that is, there have been short pieces of work that have been done showcasing specific examples. For specific contracts and specific organizations, but trying to find out how much of USAID's funding stays within contractors and INGOs and doesn't get passed through, or how much does get passed through is a real challenge. It'll be increasingly a challenge for organizations like Australia, who in their localization white paper have think very thoughtfully about the role of intermediaries and what role they could play and so on, but still have no means of actually tracking that those dynamics and how those resources flow. So let's I've got one more question which I'm going to come to Sarah to, and while I'm asking that, for our audience, please feel free, there's an awful lot of good comments in the chat. I'm going to really struggle to consolidate them. We've got a couple of questions as well, but more than just questions, you're experts on these subject matters as well, so please raise your hand, and in a minute we'll come to you and give you a couple of minutes. If you want to share your perspective, you can introduce us to your organization and your context and how you're seeing things from your perspective, and what you think the priorities should be. So while you're thinking that through, I will come to Sarah, and I will say, Sarah, so as someone who was key to driving USAID's localization journey, what advice would you give to other donors embarking on the same journey? Sorry, I started with a really hard question for you, and I'm finishing with a really hard one for you.
It's a big question, and it would take a lot of time to really answer in a thorough way. But let me just hit maybe a couple of highlights, right? So I think it's just an acknowledgement that, at heart, localization is a change management process, right? It's about how a donor approaches its work, right? It's changing how you work to achieve your goals in different ways, and to be inclusive of different goals as well. I think, to be clear, right, like the point of localization is to just, again, think about, how you can act differently. So I think there's a lot of themes, right, and of how you would go about doing this. And I'll, again, highlight just a few of them. So one is, I think a step is to generate buy-in to the cause, right? Why should people care? And I think with localization, there's been an open door for the last several years. It's hard to know how open that door is anymore. I think it's still open in many cases. It's open in a different way. It's been part of the aid effectiveness agenda for decades. Like I said, there was in the last few years a louder focus on things like decolonizing aid, and thanks in large part to like Peace Direct's work on this, and the voices of civil society coalitions like MCLD and others as well to really elevate that. But we have to continue to make that case, right? So that includes, there's been retrenchment on issues of equity in many places, and sort of moving away from that as a priority. Some highlight sort of the sparse, hard evidence, like quantitative evidence that really bears out those claims that we talk about of effectiveness and sustainability. And so there's a need to continue to make the case for why it's important, right? So next is, I think, find champions, right? That find internal and external champions, and cultivate them, right? Many donors are large bureaucracies. They work across sectors and geographic locations, and each core group of people needs someone who is motivating change and who is accountable for it. And so then I would also say to work with groups within your organization to collaboratively diagnose barriers and challenges to change, and then continue to iterate on that process. There's a lot of people who are involved in policy, partnership, programs, different funder staff roles, different partner staff roles, different community staff roles. You have to continue to talk to these people because people will have different experiences, and those experiences will, change over time too as changes are made. Um, then I think it's just to take the actions that are in your manageable interest. Not everything's in your interest, your ability to make change as a donor, as an organization, but some of them are, right? For USAID, that was looking at how do you orient a policy foundation to clarify the agency's stance, including about things like risk and capacity strengthening. There was lowering barriers, looking at how do we translate things, like Gunjan was saying, being more accessible in languages that most people speak, in places that we're working. There's opportunity to shift the enabling environment through, support and internal advocacy for things like regulatory and legislative changes that shape how a donor is able to operate. And then I think it's also just about supporting staff to implement changes, right? People talk about this as clearing the path. I think, what I saw at USAID was a lot of people who are really keen to engage in locally led development. People recognize it as just good development, right? But then there's the question of, but how do you do it, right? And so, or what are the steps that I need to take to be able to make that, realized, right? And so it's like, how do you think about, having different kinds of tools, guidance, opportunities to learn from one another, right? About how people have approached things in different ways that ends up being really important as well. Let me stop there, but those are a few that I think are really important.
Thank you, Sarah. So this is going to be really useful because obviously we're recording this, we can put this online and we can share this with a variety of organizations that we've ended up having this conversation with over the years. But we haven't got any hands up for contribution. Oh, that's not true. We've got a hand up for contributions. Just any final comments from George, Gunjan, or Dylan before we hear from our experts in the audience? Nope, was that shakes of heads? I think I saw there.
I'd rather hear from the audience.
Okay, great. All right, I think we're all agreed. So hopefully my colleague Henry can unmute Chris Umukunzi. And Chris, you can just give us a quick introduction to who you are, who you're with, your perspective, and share a couple of minutes of your thoughts, please.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, awesome panelists. My name is Chris Umukunzi, and I am the Localization and Partnership Manager for TROCARE. TROCARE is the development agency of the Irish Catholic, and I am based in Kigali, Rwanda. So I'll be speaking from the local context, though I would say a disclaimer, I'm not able to speak about localization in a global context of TROCARE globally, but I will speak from our local context in Rwanda and what we do really to achieve localization. One, I just want to make sure that the audience understands that, working in partnership with local partners basically is a core and defining aspect of what we are as TROCARE Rwanda. And our commitment to partnership stems from the belief that development must be locally owned and driven by a vibrant local civil society in the communities they represent and work with. So as a country office of TROCARE, our step change in our strategic plan that is actually coming to an end, it involves shifting the power more profoundly to our local partners. And here I'm talking about 15 civil society organizations of different shapes and different sizes, and supporting them to gain more voice and visibility within the humanitarian development systems and processes in the country. And to achieve that as a local office of TROCARE, we have committed ourselves, to a comprehensive set of actions in four main areas. And this is an internal shift, not only as an accountability, as a signatory to the Grand Bargain and to the Charter for Change or Pledge for Change, but as an organization that is accountable to the community, like George mentioned, but also accountable to our local partners. And one of those four areas we focus on is quality of our relationship. We have spent the last almost 4 years on strengthening the quality of our relationship with our local partners by fostering more open and honest dialogue, strengthening our feedback mechanisms and us creating opportunities for our local partners to participate in our governance structures as a Trocaire country. And that has really, proved to work. If we want localization, locally led development, we need to have, spaces and mechanism for these local partners to be able to influence our decision, to be able to question our decisions, and to be able to also communicate to us openly and candidly without fear of retaliation. The other area we have focused on, and I'm happy to report that I am with a colleague here who's responsible for this particular area, is capacity strengthening, not capacity building. So we accompany our local partners and invest a lot in their ambitions to become more resilient, more independent, and more sustainable organization so that they can more effectively serve the community they work with. And this goes beyond programming. We support, we work with them through a self-assessment, understanding what their real needs are, and if it's core management support, like even buying an office chair or opening an office in a local community closer to the people they work with, then we run with what they see fit. The other area is increasing voice and influence, and together with our local partners, we really work with them to amplify the voice and influence of the local organization and communities in the national, regional, and global development of humanitarian structures and processes so that they can increasingly lead and own these processes. And we've seen this working. If you help these local partners bring them to the table, help them really guide them through understanding how these processes work, they're able to take the lead. There's some spaces that we are no longer in as Trocaire as a lead, or sometimes we sub to these local partners as chair. And last and not least is the level of funding and resources, where we work with the local partners so that they access new funding from those donors who are willing, because it's not every donor in the country that is willing to have or to directly give funding to local NGOs. But together with them, we also undertake advocacy to ensure that these increased levels of global funding are allocated directly to them. That's my humble contribution, Gary.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. That's a useful perspective, a unique perspective. So over to Sumitra Manandhar again. If you can introduce yourself, tell us who you're with, and give us your perspective. If you can leave it to a couple of minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And it is very, very, I'm very happy that we have this platform today. And I'm happy to see Sarah, who I work with under her leadership through USAID for 23 years. And right now I'm working as independent consultant as well as part-time director in one of the organizations called Friends of Adwan, which also works for Dalit and marginalized communities in Asia, and some programs here in USA as well. So since I worked with a lot of local organizations, local implementer, and many more INGOs, I have both experience how it works. For these last couple of years or decades, even I worked with a number of projects. Like sub-partners as the implementer. However, the localization provided leading opportunity for local actors, which really boost up their energy. And as a lot of other things has been covered, what not is covered is I'm going to mention For example, working with host government, localization really, really, hold hand with host government that, help to energize their existing budget and build capacity, as we also build two indicators within those programs that really worked out. And the other part is other donors. My experience is also while we worked through this localization process, other donors like Swiss and UK Aid also joined hand, and they also learned what we had been doing for years, and we're happy to work together. At least I worked in a couple of those projects. UK Aid continued, but ours has been a little bit declined. Um, Still, the local partners were able to raise their one fund. Even our projects ended due to this, fund cut, and they have been continuing. So sustainability is the second part of this project, which I really enjoyed. Our objective is to help, needy people, um, women, children, and we mostly did the women empowerment through livelihood opportunities and economic development. So that was the second thing I really, see that, build up energies within the communities. Third, they also realized that they have been working with the INGOs for these many years, for decades, and now they think that, oh wow, this is the a process we need to do, and we need to work together. So there are other ways, I think, which we can also involve INGOs in different ways. So while we were doing co-creation process, there were a number of those opportunities. Local partners will also identify that what we can do and how we go together within years of experience with INGOs. So these are the short, quick things I wanted to mention in this meeting. Thank you so much for this presentation. That is wonderful.
Great.
Over to
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Sumitra. Thanks for sharing your perspective there. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more hands up. There's been lots of useful comments in the webinar chat. I wish I was good enough to be able to consolidate them somehow and report back, but I don't have that skill right now. To our panelists, any final comments from you before we wrap up?
Yeah, I have a comment, Gary.
Yeah,
that is, Gunjan and Dylan have laid out, in response to your second question, sort of a big picture on how the system needs to be changed. What I'm looking at is, short of that, how can we improve the current system before we get to that improved system? And I would suggest three ways. One is more grants to local organizations to support them in what they were designed to do, and cooperative and core support. And secondly, as I mentioned before, put the onus on intermediaries to perform in a locally led development. And that's not going to get us to the new system, but it will at least help move locally led development along. And I guess the third thing is for donors to stop writing their own country strategies and to buy into a country's development strategy that it's developed and find out a piece of that they support and like, and support that. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Gunjan, I saw that you might be coming in there, which means you might get the final word today.
Ouch. No, I just wanted to say that, there's been a lot of harm that we have seen happen over the last few months, right? We have seen, and actually there's been a lot of harm that has unfolded over the last few decades, I would say, with the development system as it is. But there really is an opportunity right now to revision this. There is really an opportunity right now for us to come together and to honestly look at what change can look like and how do we do this together. But it really does require all of us to be able to learn to trust one another. I think one fundamental challenge that we never acknowledge, to me, the white elephant in the room, is how little trust there is within our own sector, how little trust we have between ourselves and on each other. We expect funders to trust us. We expect INGOs to trust us. How can we first learn to trust one another? Because if we do not do that, if we do not come together, we are going to go back into a system which is just going to try and marginalize us, which is going to try and marginalize one set of actors at the cost of another, and is going to continue to pit us one against the other. So the only thing I wanted to say, Gary, was that I really do, and I think there is a realization of this. Dylan mentioned some of the initiatives when organizations, networks are coming together. This is that moment. Any kind of change requires us to come together. So I just wanted to make that pitch that, let us try and pull together the learnings that we have been talking about, what has worked, our visions of the world, whatever, but let us try and come together to move beyond, what is there, because otherwise we will not be able to change the system. The only power that we have is the power of our collective. Are we able to exercise it or not is what is going to determine where our world heads towards.
Thank you, Gunjan. Thank you for your optimism and for your vision. So that brings this event to a close. Thank you very much to all of our audience for joining us today. I should also thank the donors, the foundations, and the local partners who engaged with us throughout this work over the last few years and over the last few months as we produced these 3 specific reports. I'd like to thank our panelists, Gunjan, Sarah, Dylan, and George. I'd like to thank Henry Lewis, who has done the lion's share of the work, crunching all the data to pull these reports together. Sally Paxton, who's online here, she's our US representative at Publish What You Fund. And Sam Cavanagh, who has helped pull all the design and reports together as well. So thank you very much, everybody. I think that's all from us. Please get in touch with us if you're interested in any of this work and want to talk further. Until then, please take care.